Welcome, everyone, to another Earth to Class program. We're pleased to be joined once again by Carrie Leland. Very early in Carrie's career at Lamont, she gave a talk to Earth to Class, probably one of the first talks she gave to a general audience. And I
Okay,
was quite pleased a few years later to go to her doctoral defense. And now she's got a whole variety of titles. Carrie, I'll let you explain what you do.
great. Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, I can discuss some of my background as well. I have a slide on that. Can I go ahead and share my slide
Yes,
now?
you're
Okay,
all on.
perfect. All right. Can you all see this? Let me pull.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to be with you all this morning. And as Mike mentioned, yeah, I think my last Earth to Class presentation was in 2014. I actually looked that up this morning. So I'm really happy to be here again with you all and to talk about some of the recent research that I've been working on with my colleagues. Um, so I'll also say if you have any questions, feel free to just interrupt me, or wait to the end, whatever you prefer. Or you can also leave a little message. Hopefully, I can see that on my screen. Anyway, okay. All right. So, yes, today I will be talking about how we use tree ring records to reconstruct and better understand climate extremes in the past. And at the end of the presentation, I'm also going to highlight an online educational tool that's freely available. It was developed by my postdoc advisor, Dr. Nicole Davi. And since many of you here on the call might be educators, I thought that might be of interest to you as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. All right. First, I wanted to just give a little bit of background on myself. And I always get the question, how did you end up studying tree rings? And, like most things in life, it was an accumulation of random events. For me, it all started at West Virginia University. So that's where I went for my undergraduate degree. And I was studying environmental science. I was in a biogeography class with the professor, Dr. Amy Hessel, and it turns out that she was a PI of the tree ring lab there at West Virginia University. So she got me involved in research with her graduate student at the time, Stockton Maxwell, and he was studying these ancient eastern red cedar trees growing in the panhandle of West Virginia to try to understand drought histories in that region. And that was really exciting for me. I loved the field work, but I loved the lab work even more, looking under the microscope, studying the tree rings and spending hours working up the data sets. So that's how I got hooked in terms of tree ring science, and I'm still doing it today, many years later. So after that, I went on to do my master's also at West Virginia University. And then I went on to do my PhD at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, Columbia University. And I'm still there. And for my PhD, I was studying these ancient trees in Central Asia. I had done a lot of research in Mongolia, looking at the climate histories in that region going back more than 2,000 years. So I got to work on some really fascinating trees. I got interested in the morphology of these trees and the physiology as well. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those sites. And then I took on an education postdoc at Columbia for a couple years, teaching a general science class. And now I'm a postdoc with Dr. Nicole Davi at William Patterson University, still affiliated with Lamont as well. And we're working on a lot of fascinating projects looking at climate extremes in northwestern North America, Asia, and we're also studying maritime forests to use trees to reconstruct hurricane histories in the past as well. So that's been really exciting and interesting for me. It's something new. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a basic introduction on dendrochronology. I apologize if some of you are already familiar with some of these concepts, but I figured that we can just build from here. And please, don't hesitate to ask me any questions as they come up. So dendrochronology is the science of tree rings, and it comes from the Greek dendron being tree, and chronology is the study of time. So essentially, we're studying how trees grow over time to learn something about the environment of the past, going back centuries, and if we're lucky, in some cases, we can go back a couple millennia. And if you open up a tree and look at the rings, you would see in each annual growth ring, there's the light part that's called the early wood, and the dark part, that's the late wood. So those are cells put on at the end of the growing season. So with the combination of the light and the dark section, that is one annual growth ring. And the year in the middle, the pith, that's the oldest year. And then the ring just behind the bark, this is the most recent year of growth. So you're essentially going back in time as you go inside the tree. And since this talk is about climate extremes, I wanted to highlight just some beautiful old trees. I always, take the opportunity to show nice old trees when I can, because it turns out these old trees are extremely valuable for us to understand the climate extremes that we've been seeing in recent decades, right? So, in order to understand climate change and some of the extremes in temperature and droughts that we're seeing, it's really important to go really far back in time to get a historical context for those recent climate changes. So that's what makes our research really exciting because it's one of our missions to go out and find old trees, which often takes us to really remote and beautiful places. Um, so here's just one example. This is an old Bosnian pine. Actually, this is the oldest known living tree in Europe. This is in the Pindus Mountains of northern Greece. And this tree is just over 1,000 years old, which for the region is quite impressive. I took this photo maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I hope this tree is still around. I haven't heard anything, but that is me there. So you can see for scale, it's actually quite a large tree. Many of you have probably heard of the bristlecone pine. So these are the oldest known trees in the world. They grow exclusively in the Western United States, California, Nevada, and many of these are a couple thousand years old. And it's really impressive because these trees are growing very high elevation where it's really cold, really dry, very windy, yet they can still persist for millennia. So I'm still dying to go out and see these trees. I've worked with the cores from these trees, but I haven't actually seen them in person. So I'm hoping one day I can actually do that. And some old trees will surprise you. So I did not turn this photo upside down. These are some northern white cedar trees growing out of the Niagara Escarpment. And these trees can be hundreds of years old. They're not particularly big. They're very slow growing, as you might suspect, as they're growing out of rock like that. But yeah, they can be very ancient trees. And for those of you who are regional here, this is a chestnut oak that Neil Peterson from Harvard Forest loves. This is a very old tree. I think it's roughly 450 years old from Uttertown, New Jersey, if any of you are familiar with that area. Um, and so that's really quite remarkable, especially as many of the forests here were logged a long time ago. So it's really exciting to find these old individual trees, even around here. So they exist, but it does take a lot of work to find these old trees, extremely valuable for paleoclimate research. And to look at the rings of these trees, obviously we don't want to cut them down, right? So we use a tool called an increment borer, which allows us to take a core out of the tree that's roughly the diameter of a pencil, as you can see here. This is my colleague Biemba taking a core. And it's essentially a hollow drill. And it just leaves, a little injury of the cambium right below the bark where you're coring. And you get a beautiful record of the tree rings going back in time. So you can see we just sand these down, and then we have a nice record going all the way to the middle of the tree after taking these increment cores. And the trees recover from that very small injury just fine. And if we're lucky, we can also take cross sections from logs on the forest floor. And so, this is dead wood. So we'll just go in with a chainsaw and take a section like this. And this is more so common in sites that are very dry where, woody material doesn't decay very quickly. In some cases, materials like this in a dry landscape can persist for hundreds of years. And then we use a process called cross dating to actually date these segments. So by looking at just the variation in the size of the rings over time, it's like a puzzle. You can basically plug in that with the living trees in order to extend our records farther back in time, even beyond the length of the living trees. Okay. So once we have these tree ring records, then the fun part starts in terms of digging into the science. And there is a ton you can learn from tree rings. It's actually pretty remarkable, the number of different things that we can study from wood. So here I've zoomed up on some tree rings, and you can see all of these little individual cells. These are xylem cells that essentially carry water from the roots up to the top of the tree. And there are many parameters, different properties of these rings that are useful to us. So the classic property that people will study is simply the width of the rings, the size. So you can see there's a lot of variability here, right? There's some wide rings and there are some narrow rings. In the case where, trees are growing in a relatively dry area or an area limited by water, wet years will be represented by bigger rings, and dry years are represented by smaller rings. Um, it gets a lot more complicated than that, but that is the basic idea. So we can study the size of the rings. We can also study the density, how dense are, especially the late wood, this dark part of the ring. What's the variability in density? You can look at the chemical signatures, stable carbon and oxygen isotopes to infer climate variability, and also that can tell us about the physiology of trees. And now what we're doing is we're even looking at the anatomical properties of tree rings. So we use a program that actually quantifies information about every single cell from an image like this. And then you can infer a lot of climate information from that as well. And actually, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later because that's useful, especially for looking at climate extremes. Okay, so yeah, today I am focusing on dendroclimatology, using tree rings to reconstruct climate. But I just want to also briefly mention that you can use tree rings to reconstruct ecological variability. When did forest fire events happen in the past? When did hurricanes happen? Major windstorms, insect defoliations. And many people, including us here at the Tree Ring Lab, are also using tree ring records to learn something about historic structures. So if you take a piece of wood from a historic structure, by analyzing the ring patterns, you can figure out in some cases where that wood came from and how old that wood is. So it's actually very useful in terms of archaeology.
If I could just jump in here for a moment.
Sure, Mike.
I've added a lot of this stuff over the years to the Earth to Class website with some of the other talks that Carrie and Nicole have given. I'll try to beef up this year's web page and include some of these.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks so much, Mike. Great. Okay. Are there any questions so far? All good. Okay. So, yeah, in terms of figuring out, what types of environmental questions we can answer, really depends on where trees are growing. as I mentioned earlier, for trees that are growing in relatively dry locations, these trees are going to be responding to the amount of moisture or precipitation that they get every year, right? So the size of rings will tell you how much rainfall there is, for example. Turns out that the majority of trees on this planet are sensitive to how much moisture they're getting from year to year. Now, there are some trees, such as, a site on the left here, where they are more so limited by temperatures. So I'm talking about trees that are growing very high elevation near tree line. It's really cold, so cold to the point that trees almost can't grow there. Those trees are going to be responding to temperature. So if it's a warm year, they're going to put on a big ring. They can photosynthesize a lot, they can grow a lot. If it's a cold year, they're going to put on a small ring. So there are some special sites in which we can get historical temperature information as well. All right. So now I'm just going to give a couple of case studies. I mean, there's so many amazing dendroclimate studies I could tell you all about that have been done over, the last century, really. Um, but I'm going to just focus on a couple projects that I worked on because I think they're very interesting, and especially when thinking about climate extremes. So this is a site, one of my favorite sites in the world, which I've visited a few times in Mongolia. This is near the Hungai Mountains of Mongolia, and these trees are growing on an old lava flow. So this is called the Horgo lava site. And let me see if I have a picture. We were very interested in the site, working with our colleagues at the National University of Mongolia, um, because there are some ancient trees growing here on these really rocky surfaces. And some of these trees, hundreds of years old, and with both the living and the dead trees, we got a tree ring data set to cover more than 2,000 years. So really an impressive record. And we targeted this site because we were really interested in climate change in this region, right? So this is high northern latitudes of Asia, warming temperatures. In the early 2000s, there was a very significant drought that lasted for several years and had really a negative impact on a lot of people living in this region of the world, especially as there are many people living out on the landscape, nomadic herders, a lot of livestock died. So the significant drought, people were really interested in trying to put that drought into a historical context to see like really how bad was it relative to what could be natural in that system. So working with our colleagues in Mongolia, we sampled this site over several years. And here's an example of what some of these trees looked like because they're growing on rock. Many of them were stunted in growth. They had really amazing shapes, morphologies, which I did some work on as well. And yeah, here's a picture of some of our colleagues, and this is Sana. So we took a sample or we took samples from Deadwood as well to help extend our records, and really it was a remarkable collection. And I remember when we analyzed this piece of wood right here, which might not look very exciting, but this was extremely exciting for us because when we analyzed this piece of wood using that cross-dating method I described earlier, we were able to lock this in time such that it was the first piece that covered the Mongol Empire, right, which was the largest contiguous empire that ever existed in the early 1200s, led by Genghis Khan. And so finding this piece was extremely exciting for us because we realized that finally we'd be able to reconstruct what climate was like during this really notable period of time in this region of the world. So we worked up the data set, and there's a couple publications that came out of this particular site. Um, but this is the more recent one from Amy Hessel et al. From 2018. And using those tree ring records, we were able to reconstruct 2,000 years of drought history in central Mongolia. So what we're looking at here, we're looking at the year on the x-axis, and then the y-axis, this is telling us the Palmer Drought Severity Index that was reconstructed. So this is a relative measure of moisture. The the values above zero are wetter, and then the negative values indicate drier years. So you can see there's a lot of variability through time. And there were a couple interesting things that came out of this work. The first is that you can see the severity here of the 21st century drought that I described earlier. So this was indeed a really, really bad drought, but it wasn't completely unprecedented in the last 2000 years. So there were some other significant events, definitely some drier single year events, but also some extended periods of time that were also quite dry in the past. So I believe they calculated this as having a 900-year return interval. So it was definitely a significant drought, but definitely looking at this historical context from the tree rings, we know that something like this is possible in the future, especially with warming temperatures, right, which could exacerbate droughts as well. So this was really important, this research for trying to understand what was going on in the early 21st century. Additionally, there are a couple papers that came out about this fluvial. So that means it was a really, really wet period, actually, that we discovered during the early Mongol Empire. So this pluvial lasted from 1211 to 1225 CE. And it was a long period of above average moisture conditions. And this was really, really fascinating to us from a historical perspective as well, because it puts a climatic context behind what was going on. Now, you have to be a little bit careful when relating climate and human histories, right? Because human history is very complicated. Humans have agency, so we can't just simplify things down to, this worked out this way because climate was that way. But it is interesting that it was a really wet period of time, which would suggest that the landscape was also very productive during that time as well. And if the landscape was very productive, that could have potentially helped to support the Mongol soldiers as they expanded the empire during that time. Um, so that was really exciting. That spurred a bunch of other studies. Also, I'm working with historian to try to understand, really the connection between the environment and human history as well, which is still very much an important and popular topic of research that is going on in many parts of the world. Okay. So that was just one example from Mongolia, but now I do want to shift a little bit more to temperature because that's what I've been focusing on a bit more recently. And we have really fabulous temperature reconstructions from tree ring data. And once again, there are many examples to show, but here is a big publication that came out in 2016 where my colleagues had taken tree ring data from throughout the high latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere to try to understand temperature changes and global warming, over the past 1,000 years. So I believe they used, I think, like 54 or so tree ring records scattered throughout the Northern Hemisphere, as you can see here. A lot of these records were based on ring width, but also some of them were based on density as well, and something called blue intensity, which is kind of related to that. So they use different parameters from these tree ring records to try to build the best temperature reconstruction for the Northern Hemisphere. And this is what that record looked like, going back over 1,000 years. And what we can see here, so we're looking at the May through August temperatures. These are anomalies, so warmer than average and cooler than average. And the red is just a smoothing of the 10-year average of these temperatures over time. And the blue shown here, this is the historical observational data that we have, right? So only going back to, I guess, the mid 1800s in this case. And what you can see is that, we've had these extreme warming, right? So global warming is very apparent since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. And so that becomes very apparent, right? When looking at the past 1,000 years, you can see that some of these temperatures here from the Reconstruction are higher than anything that had been seen in this record. And you can also see some other interesting features, climatic features here as well. So there's a period of time known as the Little Ice Age, where there was generally cooler global temperatures. We can see that here. There was the medieval climate anomaly, which was a period of relatively warmer temperatures. And all of these things, were before we're seeing major anthropogenic human impacts over the last couple centuries. So this was is a very useful record for trying to understand the variability that has happened in temperature over time over a very broad scale. Okay. And what I also want to point out from this figure is that there are some extremely low temperatures, as you can see here, right? Some pretty extreme events. And this can be related to various things, but one important natural factor that can cause global cooling are volcanic eruptions, very massive volcanic eruptions. And we see beautiful evidence of that in the tree ring record. And tree rings in particular, in addition to ice core data, have been extremely helpful for understanding volcanic activity in the past. So, um, volcanic eruptions can influence climate and the atmosphere in many different ways. This is still very much an active place of research. Climate scientists are studying many different aspects of the influence of volcanic eruptions on climate. But essentially, when you have a massive volcanic eruption, there's the formation of sulfate aerosols high up in the stratosphere. And what that can do is that can deflect solar radiation that's coming in, which can lead to a regional or, mostly global cooling if the volcanic eruption was significant enough. So as you can see in this image, there are many different complicated factors in here as well. But yeah, so this is, a lot of folks are studying this and a lot of interesting new findings are coming out of this research every year. And in the tree ring record, so we can see evidence of volcanic eruptions in many different forms. So first is just the size of the rings. So if it's a temperature sensitive site, if the trees are responding to temperature and it's a really cold summer, let's say, then trees will produce a smaller ring, right? They may not grow as much. Additionally, if it was a very significant event, you can have what's called a frost ring, as shown here. This is a really nice image from a site called Soldav, which is also in Mongolia, actually. And I believe this was the year of 536. I hope I'm remembering that correctly. But there was a very impactful volcanic eruption that year that essentially caused cells to burst, leading to this feature, which we call a frost ring. So there's very clear evidence of that. And now a lot of folks are also starting to look at the anatomy of these extreme events as well. And this is research that I've started to get involved in. It's very laborious. It's a lot of work, but it's incredible how much information you can get just by looking at the anatomical properties of tree rings. And I have one example here by a colleague of mine named Dr. Julie Edwards. She published this work in 2020. And here she was looking at white spruce trees from Alaska to try to understand the impact of the Laki volcanic eruption on climate in that region of the world. And so, what she did from two sites in Alaska is she took what are called microsections. These are very thin sections, only like 10 to 12 microns thick. And then you can image them as shown here. They're very beautiful. And then you can use a program called Roxas, which allows you to quantify information about every single cell in these rings. For example, you can, calculate simply the number of cells, or you can look at the size of the lumen, the opening of the cell. You can look at the size of the cell walls. There are many different features that are being measured by that program. And so the Laki eruption, 1783, so she analyzed that ring in particular. Because what's really neat about this is that by studying the anatomy, we can actually figure out more precisely the likely timing of climate impacts from that volcanic eruption. So what we're looking at over here to the right is the data corresponding to these anatomical cuts. On the top, we're looking at the lumen area. So that's the size of the openings for the cells, right? So here we're looking kind of at averages across the length or across 10 sectors of each ring. So if you were to cut this into 10 parts, for example, this is what it looks like. So she does this for the year of the volcanic eruption versus non-Laki years, so other random years. And then on the bottom, she does the same thing, except in this case, she's looking at cell wall thickness. So what she found from both this site and another site is that the cell wall thickness was really reduced during the Laki eruption year of 1783, especially in what's known as the late wood. So that's like the outer, like the cells that the tree puts on at the end of the growing season. So you can see really a significant difference here between the eruption year and the non-eruption years. And so what this tells us, this is really significant because it tells us that it was really cold, likely in towards the end of the growing season. Because it gets so cold, that can interrupt the tree's ability to add material to the cell wall. So that's why the cell wall is really thin. It can't go through much of a thickening process. And so this was exciting because it gives us a sense of kind of the timing of when the cooling happened following that eruption. And all of this is really valuable for climate modelers in terms of trying to understand, where these volcanic eruptions are occurring, the atmospheric processes that happen in terms of the spreading of the sulfate aerosols, which regions are impacted at what time. So this is all really useful information that can be fed into these climate models and in terms of understanding how volcanoes can really impact climate. So this is an example of one famous eruption from Iceland and a couple sites in Alaska, but this is work that's starting to be done in many regions of the world. Okay, so yeah, once again, wood anatomy now gives us kind of seasonal scale climate information. Okay. And actually, I've been doing some of this work as well. And so, yeah, I've been doing some work in the Yukon and Northwest Territories. And we recently published a site, some anatomical data from this site called Twisted Tree Heart Rot Hill. And this was a really interesting site. These are also white spruce trees. And what we noticed looking at the tree ring width and also the density of the rings is that this year in 1959 was really, really significant in terms of low density. As you can see, it was anomalous relative to the length of that entire tree ring data set. So we were excited about this actually because now, we had this really extreme event that occurred during the instrumental record, or we used reanalysis data, but there's instrumental data that exists for that period of time in this region. So we really wanted to understand what climate conditions can lead to such a significant tree ring anomaly, because that can really help us better interpret what happens in the past before we have meteorological records. And here are some images, micrographs of this 1959 year, both from Twisted Tree Heart Rot Hill and also the Firth River site in Alaska. So visually you can see, it's a little hard to see, but the late wood here does look a little bit fainter than other years. And so we wanted to once again use this wood anatomy to kind of quantify what's going on. And what we found is that if you look at the thickness of the cell wall, right, the last sector of this tree ring, the very late wood, it turns out that it correlates very well with temperatures from late July to early August over the entire instrumental period. So what's that? That's really telling us that these trees, the thickening of the cell wall in the late wood, how much it's thickening is really telling us what temperatures are like during the end of the summer. And sure enough, what we see for the year 1959 during that period of time was that it was really, really cold in this region of the Yukon, actually Northwest Territories. It was even a little bit colder, right? So we're actually working up a data set in this area too. And we also see the 1959 signature. And essentially, what happened during that time of year was that polar air kind of descended. There was a trough. So, polar air descended into this region, which led to this anomalous cooling. It led to a frost, which we also have evidence of from documentation, from news article reports as well. So it really, this is something that can occasionally happen in this region of the world. So we were able to capture that in the tree ring data. And so this really helps us understand what that wood anatomy can really tell us, further back in the past as well. All right, so those are just a couple examples of how climate extremes, both temperature and drought, can be captured in tree ring records. Different types of tree ring parameters. I just talked about a couple here, including ring width, density, and the wood anatomy. But we can also look along different temporal scales as well, which is really exciting. And all of this is really important, for understanding kind of the atmospheric processes and how that's influencing climate extremes as well. So also very important for modeling, climate modeling exercises. Okay. Were there any general questions about that? Otherwise, I might shift gears talking a little bit more about tree ring education. Is there any questions? Okay. All right, super. All right, so yeah, now I'll shift gears and I wanted to talk about this really wonderful online education tool that was developed, I believe, in 2017 by my postdoc advisor, Dr. Nicole Davi. She is a professor at William Patterson University and has also been affiliated with Lamont for quite some time. And so she has a lot of experience working with undergraduates, and she developed this really fabulous tool for, that classrooms have been using in many regions of the world, both at the college level and even the advanced high school level as well. So for those of you involved in teaching, this might be something that is useful. In fact, Mike, has Nikki ever discussed treks for Earth to class before?
Yes, but it's been a couple of years.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. So I'll just kind of give a brief introduction to it, and then we can talk about a new lab that we recently developed, once again, looking at climate extremes. So the Trex website, you can see it here. It's through the Carleton website, and it's freely available. So you could go on today and you could look at the labs, which are very interactive. They're designed for students. And then there's also some guides that are available to instructors as well if you register through the website. And I can talk about that too. Okay. The whole objective of Trex was to get students to have a better understanding, really, of the scientific process and to truly experience science. And Dr. Davi does this in many amazing ways. First, she goes a lot into, hypothesis and idea development. She incorporates a lot of video interviews with scientists as well, so students can get a sense of what it's like to be in science. Students are dropped into the field as well with 360-degree imagery, and there are prompts and questions related to making observations about different study sites and thinking about what kind of scientific questions we can explore depending on different site characteristics. And then also there's a lot on how to process data. There's interactive graphs that students can work with. Sometimes asking students to do some online research to answer questions and also to interpret data. And much of the data, in fact, all of the data is real tree ring data that is used and implemented on the website so students can get a sense of how to do that. And she really, for all of the labs, I'd say she really distilled like some of the most interesting tree ring stories into, well, now 6 labs that I think will inspire students. I think it's very exciting for them to think about, the breadth of what we can learn from tree ring data. And yeah, students are using the same data sets and the same tools that many tree ring scientists use as well. And once again, this is really geared towards undergrads, but upper level high school students probably could benefit from this too. All right, so there's an instructor site and a student site. Once again, you need to register in order to get the guides for the instructors. And all of the labs, except for labs 5 and 6, are independent, so they can be done, different days, different times. You can mix them up depending on the interest of the class. There's a lot of flexibility built into that. And then intro material is also built into every lab as well. So, more or less, like each Trex lab will take about 2 hours, and students can work in groups. And yeah, that's all to say there. So as I mentioned, there are 6 labs. The 6th lab, I think we built that just about a year ago, maybe less than that. But the first one looks, it's basically an introduction into tree ring science. How do we launch an expedition? The second lab looks at drought variability in the Hudson Valley by having students visit the Humpty Dumpty site, which is a classic tree ring drought sensitive site in the Shawangunk Mountains. In lab 3, the students learn a little bit more about archaeology and how tree rings have been very important for dating buildings from the ancestral Puebloans, and also learning about the history of that culture as well in the southwestern United States. Lab 4 is about how tree rings have been used to reconstruct the Colorado River flow and implications for that in terms of figuring out how to divvy up water in this very drought-prone region. Lab 5 looks at warming in the boreal forests, and then we build onto Lab 5 with Lab 6 by focusing on climate extremes and impacts, particularly on indigenous peoples of the Arctic. And for lab one, I'll just kind of briefly go over what we do in this lab. So it's once again a really good intro for students, could be used as a homework as well. So it goes in really to just the history of dendrochronology, when it all started in the early 1900s at the University of Arizona in Tucson, discusses how to identify climate sensitive trees. There's some really nice videos explaining tree growth, how we core trees, and then really nice imagery of different tree ring sites, and also the tree ring lab at Lamont, so students can see what an active working lab looks like. And here are some nice videos that are provided from tree ring scientists at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Here's Ed Cook, he's the director of the tree ring lab here. And Roseanne Dorigo, she's been here for quite some time as well. And they both talk about, how they got interested in science, what they love about it, what's difficult about it. And I think, yeah, it's very inspiring for students to hear from people actively working in the field. And students also can work with what's called the International Tree Ring Data Bank. So this is an online repository where people will submit and publish their tree ring data and provide it to the community. And this is, I mean, a fabulous resource. All tree ring scientists use it all the time because there's a huge network of tree ring data that's freely available. You can even go there today to download some data as well. So students will explore some data sets from the ITRDB, figure out who the PI of that project was, and also look into the literature in terms of like why that data was useful. Okay, and then because of time, I'm not going to go into detail with labs 2 through 5, but I will talk briefly about lab 6, which is this lab we developed recently. And it really is a supplement to lab 5 in terms of global warming in the boreal forest. But essentially, we have students consider some cold extremes, especially as related to volcanic eruptions. We talk a little bit about this important period of time known as little ice age, especially the late little ice age. Um, and we look at regional and societal impacts of some of these extreme cold events. And then in part two, that's more so the past. In part two, they're going to start thinking about recent climate changes that are occurring in the Arctic. And we link to some really nice videos about some indigenous communities from Alaska and how climate change has been impacting those communities. And then in part three, we're thinking more so about the future. So, sorry, going back to part one, there's like interactive graphs. Students can look at these extreme cold events. Part two, once again, this is a really wonderful video website that has many videos of native voices from the front lines of climate change, so students can think about impacts of climate in real time, what that looks like. And then in part three, we use the IPCC Interactive Atlas for looking at climate models and considering what climate change might look like in the future, depending on these different scenarios. And they're going to be thinking about that in different regions of the world as well. So it's kind of like a past, present, and future look into climate for this Lab 6 of the TREX program. Okay. So these are, I just want to highlight, many of the partners that were involved with Nicole in developing this really great educational tool shown here. And then for Lab 6, this was part of an NSF project we have looking at climate extremes in Northwestern North America. So that really fit well into our project goals as well. So our colleagues listed here were very valuable in putting that together. Okay. And once again, it's open access, so feel free to check out the website. And of course, you can email Nicole if you have any issues or questions about the website, or me for that matter. And they can access the instructor tab in which you can learn more about how to implement these labs in your classroom. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about TREX. So yeah, so I think I'd love to take any questions or comments you have about this work, either the science or the TREX program. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Carrie. And
Thank
while people are thinking, I just have a couple of things to say. TREX is part of CERC, which is the Science Education Research Center at Carleton College. They have a tremendous number of activities that have been developed over the years by researchers and educators. Great resource for all of you. Take a look at some point. Carrie,
Yeah,
just on a side note, did you know Deb Hemler when you were at West Virginia?
Deb, what was the last name?
Hemler.
Himmler. No, what department was she in?
She may have been more in geology.
Okay, no, the name does not sound familiar to me.
She's been involved in the National Association of Geoscience Teachers with me.
Oh, very nice. Okay, okay. Has she been at West Virginia for a while, WVU?
Yes, yes.
Okay, well, I was in it was the geology and geography department, so I'm sure I did cross paths with her at some point, but at least I never had a class with her or anything. So
That's
no,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
Good person.
Yeah. Yeah, great. So many great people there. I love that department. I learned so much. Yeah.
Okay. Questions from the audience?
I have a question. First of all, thank you for a wonderful a speech and quite a lesson. Is there, since you're dealing with so many data sets, are you integrating AI in any form or intend to? Just curious, because I'm getting bombarded by people trying to sell me AI services for school.
That's a great question. So I have yet to use AI for anything. I mean, it is undoubtedly like the future. So I'm quite certain that people are, yeah, are figuring out ways to use that with our research. And I think it will be very valuable in many ways, especially working with such a large network of data and having that available. I myself haven't done any of that, but I do know it's been starting to be quite valuable for the wood anatomical work, which I talked about, because it's very time consuming work. It does take a lot of time to process those data sets. So I should be learning more about that this summer. People have been very active with trying to figure out and how to use AI to help with that process. So yeah, so I not as of right now, nothing I can think of, but I know it's on the horizon.
Is
Okay.
Rose using it for blue light?
Sorry, one more time, Mike.
Is Rose using it for blue light studies?
No, no, she's not using it for blue light. As far as I know, she's in Illinois now, so I she's working on her postdoc, so I got to reach out to her and see what she's been up to. But as far as I know, I don't think she's been incorporating that AI.
Part of the problem is the Lamont people are more intelligent than AI.
I would like to believe that, but
It just saves time, like you can feed it large data sets, like I've been doing that, feeding it large reports and data sets, and it just summarizes it for you or gives you, whatever analysis you ask it to do, and much quicker than I could, counting the little data sets.
yeah, no, it's exciting. There's so much potential there. And I know within the next few years, they're going to keep developing it. And it's exciting, but also a little terrifying feelings.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I can stop the share.
Any other questions?
I would like to ask something if it's possible, please.
Sure.
Thank you for the presentation. I think it's a very, very interesting field. And sorry if you have answered this during the presentation and my English level hasn't been good enough for this. But are there any features that have to be more proper to the trees that you use for the core data? I mean, maybe the trees that you use have to be evergreen or a kind of very specific species.
Is it? Yes, that's a great question. Right. So it really does depend on, what your question is, your research question. So in some cases, some species can provide, what's better, like a better climate signal, for example. It's more so it depends really on where trees are growing, but some species can be cross-dated a little bit more easily than others, right? Some might require a little bit more work. So there is a lot of variability from species to species in terms of what the trees are going to be responding to in terms of both climate and ecology. Um, and then also how easy they are to work with, how old they can be. There's a lot of different factors you have to think about. So absolutely, we're thinking about what species we're working with a lot because that can be important in terms of what kinds of questions we can answer.
Thank you. And how many tree curves do you need more or less to be accurate?
Yeah, so that also depends on the species and the
Yes.
site, right? So in some cases, if you're looking at, for example, ring width, there might be some sites where the trees are exquisitively sensitive to climate. So you can really get away with just using even 15 trees and they'll correspond very beautifully, and you can use that for reconstructing climate. Ideally, you're going to have more than that, right? 30 plus if you can. The more, the better, always. But for some species and some sites where maybe it's a little bit noisier, you're going to definitely need more cores in order to extract a good signal. Now, with, for example, stable isotope work or with the wood anatomical work, because it is so time consuming, we will sometimes work with fewer samples just
Yes.
because it's a necessity. But still, we make sure that we're using enough samples so that we have a nice common signal between the trees, that they're all corresponding well, because that can give us confidence that we're seeing actual like information that's useful for us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question.
Carrie, let me just mention that Beatrice is coming to you from Spain.
Oh, from Spain. Very nice. Very
Yes.
nice. Thanks so much.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, have you studied much about tree rings yet?
No, not much. This is really
There's
interesting.
time. There's time. Yeah, that's great. What grade are you in, Michael?
Eighth.
In eighth grade. Okay. Wow. That's wonderful.
At some point, we'll have you come up to Lamont and I'll give you a tour.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be great. Just let us know here at the Truman Lab. Someone will be here. So that would be great. We love to have visitors. And that goes for everybody here. If you're ever at the Lamont Lab, definitely stop by.
I guess I have one question for you. I know you mentioned on the Trex labs, lab 5 and 6 are kind of related to each other, just based on the topics. Would you recommend uh using these labs independently, or like with lab 5 and 6, do you think that you should, for lack of a better term, stack them to enhance learning outcomes?
Yeah, so Lab 6 was designed as a supplement to Lab 5. So really those two should be done together because Lab 5 sets the foundation in terms of understanding how tree rings can tell us about temperature histories. And I think students should kind of have a good handle of that to look at the climate extremes in Lab 6, particularly Part 1, which is still a little bit focused on the historical aspects. Part 2 and part 3 are more focused on like modern, recent climate change, and then also climate models for the future. So those are a little bit separate, but ideally you would stack the two.
So I could rant, as we're trying to adapt where I work, some of the environmental science labs, and tree rings definitely could be included to look at environmental change throughout history. And I don't know if I could drop in 6 labs for the students to overtake 6 labs that may go in other directions with the topic. So you would think maybe like a lab 1 and lab 2 could be used, like the earlier labs could be used a little more independently.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So all the early labs can be used independently. For sure, I would use lab one because that's like the ultimate foundation lab.
Of course.
Yes. So I would definitely, but you could stack, I think, lab one and lab five if you're interested in global warming, for example, and you want to highlight that. Or you could stack lab one with a different lab, 2 through 4, depending on what you want to focus on. But I would for sure, I would have at least two because you really need the first one to kind
Right,
of,
right, right, right.
yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, other questions?
I'd just like to comment that the tracks is very usable in high school because many of the students take college courses in high school. So I could totally see it being very adequate for high school level.
Absolutely. Yeah. And high school students, I mean, it's remarkable. They're so advanced compared to when I think about myself as a high school student and I see what high school students are doing these days, and I'm like, wow, so impressive. So absolutely. I think it could be appropriate for a lot of high school groups. And for sure, like an AP environmental science or, yeah, really any environmental science class.
Okay, so I want to thank Carrie again for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank
Beautiful
you.
day outside in this area, so I hope those of you who can will get out.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I hope you all enjoy your day. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me this morning, or at least morning here in New York.
Thank you very much, Carrie.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.